What's up, everybody, and welcome to Digging Deeper. Today we got Mariah on the show talking about your message from last weekend, and Pete is also joining in. I'm Ben. If you are listening or watching, that either means that you attend Rise City and saw the sermon yesterday and wanted to listen to more, or Dawson, who produces the show, came up with a really good title that caught your eye and you found it on YouTube or something.
Well done, Dawson.
But digging deeper, the purpose of this is really to just kind of go behind the curtain a little bit, see all that went into messages from the weekend, and to talk more and more about what maybe didn't make it into the message, all that kind of stuff. And last weekend was a really exciting weekend. It was Mother's Day. So it's a big weekend for Mariah, our next gen pastor here at Rise. We had baby dedications. You were preaching. It was Mother's Day. Lots of awesome things going.
Yes,
so
I went home and took a nap.
I bet you did. I bet you did. So I wanted to start off actually kind of going pretty deep, pretty quick. You started off your message talking about a really personal story. And I mean, I've heard about this. A lot of our staff have heard about it. But how did that experience, just in relation to Mother's Day, not necessarily your message, just shape your perspective on the importance of acknowledging, comforting maybe mothers, women on Mother's Day like that?
Yeah, it's really just my strategy. If I can get you crying in the first 30 seconds, then I feel like I've gotcha.
That's the goal.
I'm just kidding. Though Michael McGarris said he cried 4 times during the sermon. I was like,
wow.
I didn't mean to make you cry more than once. But yeah, I opened up with a story of my first Mother's Day at Rise when I had just lost my first pregnancy right beforehand. So it was kind of stressful, but one of the moms brought me flowers anyway because she wanted me to be celebrated on Mother's Day, even though I didn't have my daughter in my arms. So it was really, really sweet, especially because the mom was Jamie Grant, our founding pastor's wife. So that was very sweet. But I think that we used to have a tradition at Rise where, remember, Tiffany would get up and read that like letter on Mother's Day. Pete's like, I've stashed that out. It was like kind of acknowledging where different people come from on Mother's Day. It was really sweet, but then we did it year after year and we're like, we should try something different. And now we just go a totally different direction. Apparently we just raffle off Stanley Cups.
Yeah. Well, that was pretty fun.
That was my idea. So if you didn't like it.
Yeah. It's really cool.
Although it was a little bit messed up because one of the guys who was handing it out, his mother-in-law was the winner.
I know. It kind of seemed rigged.
A little fishy.
Yeah. They were pretty excited to be the show people.
The models.
The
they
models.
were a little overexcited.
Julie was about 3 chairs away.
Oh.
And she's like, I'm really glad I didn't win that. That would look really bad. I was like,
really
I would have
weird.
made you give it to somebody else.
Yeah.
It's very true. But anyway, I think that my experience with pregnancy loss, and then after we lost our first daughter, we got our license for foster care. And that was a world I knew nothing about. So I saw parenting from a completely different lens. In our trainings, we learned about caring for foster kids, but also at the end of our training, they brought in a mom who had her kids removed from foster care and being reunited. And they brought in another mom who had lost her kids to foster care and decided to allow her kids to move forward with adoption. And they just talked to us about what their lives were like leading up to those moments. And it really opened my eyes to how complex family life is and parenting. And then as I've gotten older and have had friends in different age ranges that have lost their moms and been kids that are struggling. So Mother's Day is just a lot more complex. But I think for me, I've had people tell me that they do not come to church on Mother's Day or Father's Day because it's just too painful.
Yeah.
So for anyone who maybe couldn't make it into the room or barely made it into the room or decided to just watch online, I was hoping that they would just feel seen for a moment. And then I took a really hard right turn, hoping that they could like understand that and then be like, I promise I won't talk about Mother's Day anymore for the rest of the sermon.
Yeah.
Come with me.
I would say I'm glad that you did. I mean, I thought it was such an important piece of the morning to start off with that and to acknowledge all that. It was really great.
Thanks.
So transitioning into your message,
Hard turn.
give us a quick summary. You had props up on stage, which I was really nervous to carry one of them out because it was like crystal.
It was glass.
I'm like, if I drop this.
Are you guys old enough to remember the comedian Carrot Top?
No.
Isn't that a snowboarder?
I don't. So no, that's he looks like Carrot Top, but that's somebody. That's Sean White. Yes, Carrot Top is a comedian who's all
I'm
props.
nailing sports
He
this
would
week.
like pull props out of a. I'm not going anywhere with this. I was just comparing you to an old comedian that uses props.
Thanks,
but it was cool though because I actually sitting in the audience. You had mentioned you might do it. Mm-hmm. And I actually liked it. I thought it kind of like helped me follow where you're going.
Yeah.
Were you able to
it was great.
Figure it out?
I just couldn't see the smallest one from where I was sitting. It was an angel, I guess, right?
Yes.
Yeah. That was the one in question. Yeah. That if anyone's going to drop it, it's going to be me.
I ordered these all on Amazon and thought they were far larger.
Are you going to be returning these to Amazon?
No, I shall not.
Good for you.
No, I have ethics.
Integrity.
And
I like it.
Who would do that?
I don't think.
Do that?
I couldn't imagine a former lead pastor of our church buying props on Amazon and returning them the next day.
For our listeners, we were focusing on a mother, right? A very prolific mother.
Probably not prolific.
I'm
Depends on your
mixing
theology.
those words up. Yes. Renowned mother, Mary. And these props were walking through the journey. It was kind of an outline almost for you. So what were each of those? Give us like a fly overview of the different
It
props
was great that we had the
represented.
props because first service, I got through my notes, pages 1, 2, 3. Then I turned the page and it was 6. And the next one was also not in the correct order. So after page 4, I just had to ditch them completely and just wing it.
That's terrifying.
So it was great because I had all the props there. So I didn't forget where I was going next. So the idea for this was that I had this idea at Christmas when Mary's almost always talked about. Mm-hmm. And then it feels like we never talk about her again. And I was just curious, like, well, where does Mary go from here? Because in the Christmas story, when she gives birth to Jesus and the shepherds come, there's a little tagline that says, and Mary pondered all these things in her heart. Or Mary treasured up all these things in her heart. And so I just wondered, well, what did she do with that? What did she do with it? So that spawned that idea back at Christmas time. So when we had an opening for Mother's Day, I was like, oh, I could do that. I'll talk about Mary. So I went out to figure out every single time Mary appears in the New Testament, which I couldn't put them all up, but it's like 12 or 13 times because sometimes there's a mention to Jesus's mom and you're like, well, does that count or does that not count? Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit over a dozen or so. So I picked out 6-ish and we hopped the timeline of her life from story to story. So we started with the angel appearing to her, saying that she was going to conceive Jesus. And then we kind of squished together the nativity and them fleeing to Egypt. And then we jumped to Jesus being 12 and being lost at the temple. Well, he wasn't lost, but lost in Jerusalem. He was at the temple. Then the wedding at Canaan where Jesus turned water to wine. Then at the cross, Mary's mentioned as being there. And then finally, Mary is mentioned in a group of people that are in the upper room. And a couple days later is when Pentecost happens. So there's good scholarship to believe that she was in the room during Pentecost, but it doesn't specify her on that day. But I think that's pretty likely.
Yeah. And all of that centers around, most of the sermon, even the main idea of the sermon centers around that tape that you put down, that like line in the sand moment where she pre-decided. Could you explain what you mean by that phrase? Pre-decided?
Yeah. Well, to start with, first service, I put the tape on the ground kind of slowly. Second service, I whipped the tape out fast and it made a noise. And I saw probably a dozen heads whip up. Ah! I was like, oh, I got your attention now, don't I?
Woke them up.
Yeah. But the idea was that when Mary was that teenage years, 14, 15, and the angel came to her and told her all these things were going to happen to her, that her response to the angel was, I am the Lord's servant. May all you've said about me come true. And it was just this huge moment. When I read it, it just knocked me down because I want my life to be defined like that. And in this moment, Mary, to say those words, she was giving up so much. So she knew how hard it would be to be a now single, pregnant, teenage mother in her culture. But she counted the cost and said, I'm the Lord's servant. So whatever you have for me.
How do you think we could learn from that decision in our modern context?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of identity. So really what it comes down to is who are you when everything is all said and done? Who are you when you're sitting in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, and like all of the flash and all the things you've tried to put on have fallen away? Who are you? And this first came to me, I guess this is related to Mother's Day, but I was walking from my house. I've talked before about how we've lost a few kids, but in there we went through 4 years of infertility where we couldn't get pregnant. And I was walking from my house to the Dollar Tree to get another pregnancy test. And I was walking back and thinking to myself, if this is negative again, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I just felt the Holy Spirit say, if this test is negative again, you're still the Lord's servant and a loved child of God. And that's when it just hit me that nothing that happened in my life, one way or another, could shake who I was. That even if like everyone I loved died in a nuclear bomb and I'm the only one alive and I get dropped in Bangladesh, I'm still the Lord's servant and I still believe that there's purpose to my life. I believe that God can create beauty out of my life all over again, even if I had to start over. And that deep certainty that comes from being the Lord's servant and the servant of such a good, worthy God brings stability to everything in my life.
I was thinking like, when you tell a story like that, I always enjoy those kind of things because they let my brain think about things that I don't normally think about. And, you kind of walk through her story and then she's in the upper room in the book of Acts. And to be honest, I think just hearing the story my whole life, if you could like take a snapshot of what my brain is imagining when Jesus is on the cross and Mary's there, she's like an old frail woman who's like Grandma Mary. And then I was like doing the math and I was like, we don't know exactly, but Jesus was probably early 30s and she was probably 14 or 15 when she had him. Mary was like my age.
Wow. Old frail Pete.
She was like 47 maybe. I'm not 47 yet, but like she wasn't 50 yet. She still had a life ahead of her. And I think what's interesting is, and I'm in a completely different boat here, both as, as a man or whatever, but like it is common. All humans do this. We just do it in different things, that we find the thing that we think is going to give us meaning or purpose. And if we don't get it, we feel like we don't have purpose. But the reality is, even some of those things, if you do get them, like if your purpose is in childbearing, who are you when your kids graduate and go off to college?
Absolutely.
If your purpose is in your career, do you stop having a career when you retire? Like, and I think like the idea of I am the Lord's servant goes beyond all of those temporary things. Like you never, from the moment you pre-decide that to the moment you're in the grave, nothing in your life, no circumstances in your life, no things you might dictate your ability to be the Lord's servant and fulfill your calling. Like your kids will grow up, your job will change, like whatever, like your money comes and goes, all these kind of things. But for Mary, I think to rethink for myself of like, when she joined the disciples in the upper room, like she wasn't that much. I mean, I don't know how old like Paul was or whatnot, but he was probably older. Like she was a matriarch. She was older, but she still had a life ahead of her. And for all we know, she spent the next 20 years like preaching the gospel. I mean, like she had a whole life ahead of her. Her purpose as a human being wasn't just to be the mother of Jesus. It was to be a servant of God who continued even after to spread the gospel. And so I think that's something so powerful for all of us to say, like, if my purpose is beyond just having kids or have a family, my job, all this career, like, it's like, no, I am the Lord's servant from now until the day I die, and I will always find purpose in that, identity in that.
Yeah.
And I don't think that was her first moment of saying that. I mean,
Right.
she's 14 or 15. There clearly was experiences before she got to that age that already had her on the trajectory of getting to the point where she was ready to make that choice.
Mm-hmm.
And a choice that, that stuck. But also, the Lord could have picked anybody, and he picked Mary for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wish I understood what happened in the first 15 years of Mary's life.
Yeah. What's cool though is that as you look over those 30 years, there was a theme that was kind of interwoven. I don't know if you actually like explicitly said it, but her faith keeps being modeled in each one of those chapters. That was like a prop on stage. Like each one of those, her faith was displayed in some way, and her faith was confirmed also in some way, which was pretty cool. But when she was 14 or 15, I always think about this, like, especially around Christmas time, we know the whole story. So it doesn't feel like that big of a decision. We're like, well, didn't she know what was going to happen?
Mary, did you know?
Like, she
Is that
didn't.
what you're trying to say?
Right. I was not, but that's actually pretty great. Like she didn't know what the next 30 years was going to look like. But because she made that decision, like God was just faithful to her throughout the whole thing. What can we learn from that? Like, what can we learn as we're all making decisions constantly, as we're trying to follow God's heart and his will for our lives, like wherever we might be at? What can we learn from that saying yes and that saying I'm a servant?
Well, it's interesting to think through as you're talking. I guess it's just hitting me that when I was a teenage girl, about 14 or 15 is when I decided to follow Jesus with my life. So I was part of a youth group. If any of those youth group leaders are listening, they will remember how insufferable I was. I attended, my parents took us off and on to church as elementary schoolers. I attended middle school, but it was that summer between my 8th grade and freshman and sophomore year. I was at youth group. We went to a conference and they did an altar call of sorts. And I just realized that I was done trying on all these different ways of living, and that it was clear to me what was true, and I wanted to live my life in the truth. And that I was looking from place to place to finally feel somewhere I felt safe and wanted and belonged, and that Jesus was the only place that had ever been true for me. So there had been a time, I think when I was like 11, that I had, prayed that prayer to be saved, but it was that 14 or 15 where I decided and I went forward. And for me, that was that. Like I had decided and I moved forward in my life in Jesus. But I know that's not a lot of people's stories. A lot of people, they come forward when they're 14 or so, and then they kind of go their own way and they come back when they're adults or parents or whatnot. I think you were older when you like made your final decision, right?
Yeah, I was about 20, 21.
Mm-hmm.
But I relate to the pre-decision stuff is powerful. I actually heard, was that a book? Groeschel, did he write that book?
I don't know. Robert helped me work out the language on that.
Yeah, there's a great, oh man, gosh, my brain's not working. I've heard it taught, and I actually use this myself. The phrase I really liked was preemptive holiness.
Go ahead and unpack that, sir.
So, I actually I talked about this at the men's retreat, a different men's retreat for a different church a while back. And the idea is like, looking at like warfare and how throughout history, warfare was always two armies lining up and just running at each other. But then with the advent of starting kind of in the Revolutionary War, but then moving on and growing into Vietnam, you started having guerrilla warfare where it was a different kind of fighting. And ultimately you have 9/11 where now, like, and I've been watching a whole documentary about the Cold War, and it's interesting how much the world has changed. Like, we're not in a Cold War anymore. We're two massive superpowers are just facing off. Our primary adversaries are people hiding in internet cafes. And so like the way that you fight that battle is not standing strong and carrying a sword. It's being proactive. So we battle terrorism primarily by things like the TSA. So when you go to the airport and they check your bags, they are preempting the ability for you to hijack an airplane and run to a building. Mm-hmm. And the idea being like, I look at all the things in my life where it feels like airplanes are hitting buildings, and I'm like, oh, my life is, I keep doing this thing. And it's like, well, rather than like, when the terrorist has the control of the airplane, it's over. You've already lost. Mm-hmm. And we often want to fight sin that way. When we see the terrorist grabbing controls of the plane, we're like, okay, how do I fight this now? And it's like, actually, you should have been fighting it at the airport. So instead of being like, oh, I'm struggling so much with this thing I'm looking at on the phone, it's like, well, wait, there's decisions you could have made 4 hours ago that would have kept you from even being able to look at that on your phone. So you make a pre-decision. You decide in advance, I'm going to screen at the airport. I'm going to screen things in my life now. You said like, I'm going to decide now what's going to be in that cup at the dorm party, mm-hmm. which I did. There was a moment in my life where I said, I'm going to decide now, because I know myself, that I'm just going to stop drinking. And that was 25 years ago. And I decided I'm going to wait till I get married. And I did. So like those pre-decisions. And then when you're in the moment, it's like, well, I already decided that. And because I decided that, I put up certain blockers that don't allow me to even go in the direction. Mm-hmm. So when you read the scriptures and you encounter something that God is saying, this is what I want for your life, as a follower of Jesus, what I'm supposed to do is say, well, I've already pre-decided that Jesus is Lord, so this applies to me. Now, how do I then decide now that this is going to apply to me and apply it to my life? And I work through the Bible that way. Because Jesus is Lord, all of his commands apply to me. I've pre-decided that. There's no debate moving forward. I don't have to argue with myself whether I'll be generous. I've already decided Jesus is Lord. He told me to be generous. And I just live my life constantly. I've already decided. Now I just have to do it.
There's also an element, though, of making sure when you pre-decide that you counted the cost. And that was, I think, what was so special about Mary. I think she understood what this meant when she even asked follow-up questions. She was confused and disturbed. Well, why was she disturbed? Well, this is a disturbing, supernatural incident, but I think she understood. And that, to me, can be sometimes an Achilles heel of the pre-decision, is when you pre-decided because your mom told you dorm parties are bad, as opposed to you thinking through, okay, how's this going to go for me? What's this going to look like? And deciding, so when you don't think through if you want Jesus to be the leader of your life and why, and you ask those questions, it took me a long time to come to faith in Jesus because I had a lot of questions. Like, can this Bible thing be trusted? Can this and that? But on the same token, I've known other people that have gotten saved because they knew it for sure in a different sort of way. Mm-hmm. Like they had a spiritual awareness. They're like, no, I know for sure. And we're cool to make that decision.
Yeah. So we keep talking about a pre-decision or something that you do before anything happens, but you ended the message with a almost question that's on the other end of things. You said, where will you be at the end of it all? What did you mean by that?
I think I kind of left it ambiguous so that it could land in people's hearts in the way that it needed to.
Those are my favorite kind of
endings. So was it, where do you want to be at the end of it all, as in like the end of your life? Like when you're on your deathbed, like what do you want your legacy to have been? But it also could be, where do you want to be at the end of this era of raising your kids? Where do you want to be at the end of this day right now? Where do you want to be, at the end of your career? What do you want them to say about you as a person and how you operated?
That's cool.
Behind the scenes question. I was only in first service. Did you end where you wanted to, or did you run out of time?
I ended-ish where I wanted to.
Okay.
Yeah. But but first service, my husband mentioned to me that I never talked about some of the props. Like, he's like, I didn't understand the fire. Like, why was there fire? And then second service, I explained, like, on the day of Pentecost, the writers of the Bible wrote that it looked like flames of, like, tongues of fire coming. But I didn't say that first service. So he was like, did they have a bonfire after something? And I'm like, no.
Is Mary cooking s'mores?
Yeah.
Doing s'mores.
Hey, this is a behind the scenes thing. And I think one of our listeners who's a pretty faithful listener will like to hear this shout out. her husband, Mackenzie, who plays on the worship team, I walked in to the auditorium in the morning before we were rehearsing, and he's like, Ben, there's a fire backstage. And he like freaked me out so bad.
That's good.
I ran back there and I saw your little paper fire. So, Sarah, if you're listening,
I love Sarah.
give Mackenzie a shout out.
Excellent.
It's pretty fun. Was there anything from any of the different instances that you saw Mary show up in scripture that could be helpful for any of us to hear? Or is there maybe a reason that you didn't choose those?
No, a lot of it was time. We had baby dedication, so we wanted to keep it at 30 minutes, which was funny because Pete was like, "Oh man, we don't have time for 40 minutes. Do you think you could do like 30 or 35?" And I was like, "I used to be a youth pastor. I can make it 20 and change your life."
Are you someone who like plans way too much and has to cut down, or are you someone who's like, no, I need to work up to the time?
It pretty much comes out how it comes out, and then I just cross my fingers that it's in the time frame.
Okay.
I'll pretend I didn't hear that for next time.
So generally, I'll like sit down to write a message, and I will just write it nonstop in one draft. And then it just kind of ends where it ends. And then I'm like, well, that looks about 30-ish minutes. So far, the Holy Spirit hasn't let me down. It's always 30 minutes.
So in those other instances, though, does it follow this theme? Like, do you see her life kind of following that same theme of I am the Lord's servant?
So in this particular situation, I knew I wanted to look at Mary. So there was so much to research that I texted all the people in my life group and asked if anyone wanted to help me with research.
That's cool.
And so then we split up all the different instances that Mary appears and double checked each other's work. And so we got together on a day. It was Krista Arthur and I ended up getting together, and we went through it all together just to see if a through line would appear. And then it did. And then I had a hard time wording it, and I was talking it through with Robert. And then I was talking about colleges and pre-deciding. And he's like, I think that's probably where it is right there. You harp on that word. And I was like, okay. So I took it back and molded all through, and then, tweaked it and sat down and did the final like right through, which was really fun. I love working with people. Like Pete has talked before, like he likes to get a sermon and to go into his office and see what comes. And I much prefer to bring a topic to a group and hear everyone talk, and then it starts to form itself in my brain really quickly after that.
I'm sure that they were pretty excited to listen to your message then and to be like, oh, I told her that. I
hope Krista was.
Yeah.
Thanks, Krista. But there were things that I cut out along the way that just were definitely applied, but I'm just like, So if you'd like to go and find all 12 to 13 times Mary appears, I encourage you to do so.
So I'd love to know then, this is kind of like a summarizing question, but people listening, if there was one thing that you're like, if they forgot about the rest, I want them to hear this, and here's what I would hope that they would do with it. This is like a 2-part question. What would you hope that they heard? And 2, how would you hope that they would respond?
Well, I think it's kind of where I landed it for everybody was like, you see the life of this person who made a decision and then lived it out, even though it wasn't perfect. But what's, I'm sure you're all sitting here saying, that was great. I loved that. She made a decision and look how great it worked out. Okay. Well, if that's true, then why not for you? And so that's really what I wanted people to leave. Like, what is it that's stopping me? And what is it that I'm living for? Because if you're not living for Jesus, you're living for something. And I think that our culture doesn't believe that's true. Like, I just don't live for anything. Like, I don't think so. I think you live for something.
What are some of those situations or decisions that people could be making, maybe that you were thinking through as you were writing the message, praying through that people would make these decisions? Like, what are some of the things that you were like, man, if someone made a decision for their family in this way, or stepped out in faith in this way? Like, what are some of those things that
there's like a couple categories
came up in your mind?
Because like, what could be stopping you from making a decision for Jesus to be the leader of your life could be things that you really do need to work out. Like, well, I just don't know if I can trust the Bible. It's like, man, that is honest. And so honest is always great because then you know where you're going. That's great. How can we help you figure out if that's legit or not? How can I help you find resources from people who don't believe the Bible's legit and do, that you can start studying? And so you can work through that. Or I've got an emotional hang up of, I was raised by a stepfather who believed in Jesus and it's just so hypocritical. Okay, that's standing in the way. Let's work through that. Like, let's get on it. But then there's the other things that are like, it's not intellectual or emotional hang up. It's just that I like to be the driver of my own car. And I don't want anyone to tell me what to do, or I can't give God control or leadership in my life because that belongs to my kids. My kids' happiness is the thing that leads everything in my life. And if my kids want to do 27 sports year round, then we do it. And so there's two different categories of things like we honestly need to work through, and the other things that are just like, there's someone else in the driver's seat. And until you decide to switch them.
Yeah, that's helpful. I was just asking for context for people that may have been listening who are wondering what kind of decision that they could be making or what the Lord might be leading them in. And I think Pete nailed it when he said like your predecision affects your other decisions along the way. The predecision to follow Jesus means that every decision about your life should be informed by that predecision.
Yeah. And thank goodness it is.
Yeah. And many of us.
He's the only one that knows the future.
Yeah.
Loves us, has the best in mind for us.
Yeah. And many of us that were, sitting in the room listening to your message had already made that decision. And so like the way I was internalizing it was, what kind of decisions can I make now? Deciding to follow Jesus isn't just like a one-time occurrence, but it's something that decision informs. How do I decide to be a parent? How do I decide to be a husband? How do I decide to go about, my work and to, have a relationship with my boss and, all those kinds of things.
I think if we're still going with the car analogy of like Jesus in the driver's seat of your life, even as Christians with Jesus in the driver's seat, if we're not conscientious, we start to like creep over and like put just one hand on the steering wheel. And then maybe in other situations, we've got two hands on the steering wheel. Before we know it, we're like on his lap and we're really just doing, and we're telling him when to hit the gas and the brakes. And like as Christians, sometimes we have to like stop, recalibrate. Just the Calibrate series.
Let's call back. Thank you.
And just get back to where we are. Because if you're like this steering the car, you're going to get a backache because you were never meant to be in that sort of a position. And when we're truly where we're supposed to be and he's where he's supposed to be, there's shalom, there's peace, there's tov, because that's how he literally designed it. So any other arrangement is going to chafe, if not really hurt.
Yeah.
And that's the burden that I sit with my friends that don't know Jesus. It's not like, oh, I can't believe you don't know Jesus. You're not a good person. I'm like, oh, he didn't make you to live this way. And I know it's causing pain for you somewhere, and that breaks my heart. So when I call people to that decision, it's not like a shame thing. It's I don't want that. I don't want that pain for you.
Right.
And neither does God.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, Pete, did you have any other questions or anything that you wanted to throw in there?
I just feel like the way that you approach this, well, he has so those of you that aren't watching, he has his laptop out and you had like legit questions that were like thoughtful and applicable. And I usually show up with this podcast like, what did you talk about yesterday? And now I feel like next time I do this podcast, I have to like...
See, I honestly wish I was more like you. I don't feel like I'm a great off-the-cuff talker. I have to have a plan in my mind.
Those are good questions.
How my brain works.
One thing I'll just end with is it's kind of it's not fully a tangent, but the thing about predecisions too, and there's another way that like another word that you could use for predecisions.
Just decisions?
Well, no, it's not like, there are, let's use the word like sin, right? There are certain things that you have to pre-decide you're not going to disobey God, right? That's a pre-decision. But then in life, you kind of move past things that are like ethically or morally right or wrong. And you then, I think you stop maybe talking about pre-deciding not to sin, and you start using the word values. Like values are things that we're not talking about right or wrong. We're just things that you have decided in your life, in your family, in your church, that you've pre-decided you're going to follow this. So, at Rise, we have a set of values, and I think as human beings, we all have them. We just don't always actually talk about them. But I actually do think that talking about them, getting out on the table, my wife and I have tried this a few times, and part of the problem is I think it's a good idea, and then we try to put it in practice. But like, what are our values as a family? What are my values in the way that I want to work? I've like pre-decided, will my dominant drive in my life be money, enjoyment at work, success, climbing corporate ladder, like value? And none of those things are right or wrong, but like, what will be my core value that drives my work life? Will I be somebody that will risk anything and sacrifice everything to succeed, or will my primary value be stability, or will it be, like those things? You've moved past right and wrong, and you've said like, what are my, so like, even as a family, as a married couple, to say like, what do we want to value? How will we want to spend our money? Right? Because you can say like, okay, well, the Bible says, but let's move past that.
Do you want to, are vacations really important to you guys?
Exactly.
Or is it private school is really important?
Exactly. And my wife grew up in a home that summer vacations with the family were like a big deal. And I didn't. That wasn't a big deal to me. I think we took 2 my whole childhood. So for us to come together and to talk about it, and her to say, hey, listen, I want to pre-decide that this is going to be part of our life. And so now we don't have the conversation of, should we take a vacation this summer? Every summer, the conversation is, what are we going to do this year? We've already set the value, the pre-decision of this part of our life. So I think there's the whole set of pre-decisions about following Jesus and obeying him. And then you move into okay, now what kind of life do I want to live? That I've moved past like the right and wrong. Right. And I'm now more like, well, what kind of things are important? I think pre-decisions are so, you can use whatever word you want, but they're one of the most important aspects of premarital counseling.
Right.
What things can you decide now before you put those rings on, that this is how you're going to live your lives together? And when you say yes to Jesus, you're putting a ring on, and you're saying, okay, so I'm pre-deciding. Like you said, I'm counting the cost, I'm thinking about it. Absolutely. Lots there.
I'd say, the summarizing statement here, one of the biggest takeaways for me was the powerful reality that she made a pre-decision, but it didn't mean that her life was just easy because of a decision. Like the crises that followed,
many
were many. Yeah. And watching your son die and be murdered in front of you. Does it get worse than that?
Well, and before that, there's a moment where it kind of sounds like the text implies that Mary was like, Jesus, what are you doing? Like, what is this? Like when Mary heard the angel say your son is going to be the Messiah, she would have thought, oh, my son's going to be
reigning king.
A king and a revolutionary, and is going to raise an army at some point. Yeah. And then he starts his ministry. And was she like, what, no, Jesus, that's not what I want you to do.
I've sacrificed all this, expecting you to do this.
Yeah. And Jesus was like, hey, who are my mothers and brothers, my family, those who do the will of the Lord? Are you the Lord's servant or not? And Mary would have been like, yeah, okay.
Yeah. He like put his mom in her place,
There's
I'm a little bit conjecture, because it's just the text, it kind of says family. I don't know if Mary was part of that, but definitely like brothers, sisters, siblings.
There's so much that we skipped. So this was, I was telling someone else, this was a hard sermon for me in some ways, because instead of picking a text and diving deeply into it, I picked a million texts and skipped and jumped and only looked at certain parts of each text, which makes me feel like a little insecure, because anybody could step up and be like, that's not what that story was about. I'm like, I'm not saying that was the main purpose that the wedding in Cana existed. I just am trying to look at these pieces of who you see Mary being. So it leaves so much room for your life group this week to dive into every story.
Is that like a real part of your personality? What you just described? Like that somebody would call you out and being inaccurate on something?
Absolutely.
And then you're like, it's like a nightmare or something?
Not a nightmare. I want truly to be correct. Not to be right. Like, I'm right and you're wrong. No, I want to be correct. So if I'm incorrect, I want someone very much to tell me so I can correct that.
Because Robert got me on that.
What?
We did a podcast on April Fool's Day, and he played a
right.
prank on
he
me.
did a joke.
How-
Yeah.
And I went
pronounced.
back and watched it because I looked at my face and I was like, he got me.
He really
Like,
did.
I was terrified that I had just been called out for being wrong about something
Publicly.
on a public podcast. And it was literally like he like needled like one of my deepest fears as a human being.
Yeah.
Like, you son of a.
He knows you pretty well.
That was so good.
Yeah.
Anyway.
The reason I brought up the crisis, though, the powerful part to me is the fact that you can make a pre-decision. Doesn't mean that things are going to be easy or smooth sailing, but it does
Wasn't for
mean
Paul.
that you have steadfastness in your faith, and that
Yeah.
you can have hope, and that you can know that you are living right in the place that you're supposed to, even if it gets scary, even if it gets crazy. So maybe that's encouraging to someone listening today,
Absolutely.
or even encouraging them to say, I am going to make a decision.
And
So.
if you're considering making a decision about Jesus, that is literally why we're here. So please, we'd love to talk with you. We'd love
Yeah.
to get you maybe in a rooted group when that comes back around. We've got Rise U this summer.
Yep. That's great. Awesome. Well, we got one meal this next weekend, so I'm not sure if we'll do digging deeper on that. We might.
We'll have to play it by ear. I'm
We'll
not
play
sure.
it by
either.
ear.
We
Yeah.
can all talk about
Yeah.
our scoops of rice
Yes.
for 30 minutes.
We'll keep you all on the edge of
It's
your
actually
seat.
so fun to watch all the families working.
is.
So
It really
It'll
is.
be a blast.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're looking for a serving opportunity, come on out to
I
Rice
have a
City
question
this week.
about rice.
Rice.
Is it a vegetable or a legume?
I think is it a wheat? Is it a bushel?
You can't make tea out of rice, can you?
Nobody understands. We were having this conversation before the podcast
This was 30
started.
minutes
If you want to
before.
leave a comment and let us know.
I think coffee is a tea. I'm just putting it out there.
It's
All
a
right.
tea.
It's a tea.
Yeah, I don't know.
Smushed up vegetable you put in hot water.
It's not a vegetable. It's a bean.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.